Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
And I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
Cameron, today I would like to ask you about the components of It's a Wonderful Life. And we'll start with the film, a classic for this time of the year, but then move on maybe to what is it that people love about that film, and then think about what it means to have a wonderful life in 2023. So that's the trajectory we're on here. Hey, but you're the film guy. Fill us in. I'm going to go out on a limb and say the majority of our audience has seen the film It's a Wonderful Life, but can you give us the Cameron Spark Notes version? Bring us all up to speed.
Well, the first thing is that most people didn't like It's a Wonderful Life when it came out. This movie was a failure. I don't know if you knew that, Nathan. This movie was a real commercial failure.
I did not.
So a couple of interesting, I'll just spit out. Yes. So the reason you know about It's a Wonderful Life, and I know about it, any of us, is actually kind of a happy accident. When the movie, and I won't spit out all the facts here. It's worth just look it up. Basically, it's a happy accident. It was released in the public domain for a little while, and then it got wide circulation because of that. And more people came to see it, and it became a classic at that point. When it was released, it didn't do well.
What year are we talking here?
It was
roughly.
You know what? The precise year of It's a Wonderful Life is escaping me. Let's hunt that fact down here in a second. But when it was released, it didn't do well. And so, for instance, my favorite critic, I think it was 1946 when It's a Wonderful Life was released. And that's right. Yeah, 1946.
Oh,
so
yeah, okay.
My favorite critic of all time, James A.G., who is a wonderful writer, marvelous writer. Love his reviews and his film essays are I just cherish them. They're so beautifully written. He hated It's a Wonderful Life. This is one of those moments where you even had some of the best critics arrayed against this film. He thought it was very sentimental and a lot. So it just didn't do well. Now, interestingly enough, James Stewart, who plays George Bailey, the main character of the movie, came to regard this as his favorite film he had ever done. Now, I don't know how many movies are in James Stewart's filmography, but it's extensive. The man had a massive acting career. So the fact that he came to view this as his finest achievement, or the film that just he had the fondest memories of, is pretty remarkable.
Mm-hmm.
But now, of course, It's a Wonderful Life is not regarded at all as a failure. In fact, most people, when they hear that, are shocked, because this is, I would say, probably the Christmas classic for most people. And it seems to be carried down from generation to generation. I have seen some jokes recently about how millennials haven't embraced it as much and all of that. I mean, Nathan, you and I are in the same category here. The generation speak, it's a little annoying to me after a while. In my experience, I'm a geriatric millennial.
That's right. We're on the upper end.
Correct. I grew up watching it and loved it and have cherished it, and I think
it's safe to say that
as well. I saw some
anything with a 1946 release date. I think we can say whatever we want and consider that not to be a spoiler alert, because if you haven't seen it,
oh yes,
you've had time.
Oh yeah, there be spoilers, but it's 1946, so get over it. But also, yeah, I think I saw something obscene the other day. I'm going to get myself in trouble here, but I don't care, because here we go. Somebody said, for us millennials, the Muppets Christmas Carol, that's our It's a Wonderful Life. Absolutely not. What utter nonsense and trash. By the way, I don't like the Muppets, okay? I don't care what you say. They're aggravating as all get up. I know they're imaginative. Jim Henson this. Yes, I get it. That is in no way is the Muppets Christmas Carol comparable to It's a Wonderful Life. Let's get some perspective here. All right, end rant. Sorry.
So summarize the film for us as best you can.
Well, I mean, this is the story of George Bailey, and who will be played when he's grown up by James Stewart. And he lives a life of self-sacrifice, starting with now, it's also worth pointing out here, Nathan, this movie is heavy going. It's heavy stuff. So as a kid, there were several scenes in this film that really upset me. One of them, and so I'm going to give you a series of vignettes rather than just a boring plot summary. But the movie begins with George Bailey saving his brother's life, because there's a sledding accident and his brother falls through the ice. He saves his brother's life. But then there's another scene, and again, this is just think if you usually when I was a kid, I associated black and white films that my parents would let me watch with kind of a sentimental or softer vision of reality. And yet, in the beginning parts of It's a Wonderful Life, there is George Bailey is working for he's as an assistant for a pharmacist. I don't know if you remember this scene,
Mhm.
Nathan. And the pharmacist is grief stricken because he's lost his son and he's drunk and he gets the prescription wrong and he puts the wrong pills into a bottle. And this is a mistake that would turn out very badly. In fact, this would cause a fatality if this actually happened. So George challenges him and he's so distraught and so upset, he starts slapping George.
That's
And
right,
George, by
yeah.
the way, who's sustained an injury in one of his ears from saving his brother. So he slaps him, and then there's blood coming out of his ear in this scene. And finally, the druggist realizes the mistake he's made, and then is very repentant and hugs George. But he's here he is slapping this little boy around, and there's blood coming out of his ear. I mean, so this is a film that it may be accused of sentimentality, but when you watch it, I think you're going to be surprised. It's pretty rough in some scenes. And
Yeah,
then
so far you're really
not to
selling it as A
mention
Wonderful
the
Life.
kind of right. Well, I mean, there's a whole lot of reality packed into this movie. So, and also it's worth pointing out, and my colleague and friend Ken Boa has a wonderful analysis of this movie. This is one of Ken Boa's favorite movies, but he points out that George Bailey he does a lot of good things. He's a good man in most ways, but he's a deeply flawed character from the start of the movie. There's a hardness and there's a bitterness to him, and that's absolutely true. So there are another scene that upset me as a kid. Here's another vignette for you, and you'll remember this one probably, Nathan, is when the girl who he's going to end up marrying is falling in love with him, but he is simultaneously realizing in this moment that if he marries her, and her name is Mary, his dream of being a world traveler, seeing the whole world, getting out of Bedford Falls, that has to die, or at least it has to take a back seat because then he'll be married, he'll have a responsibility, and so he grabs her very roughly and he shakes her and he says, I don't want to get married. I'm resisting the urge to give a Jimmy Stewart
I'll do it. Come
impression
on.
here, and I'm not going to do
Just
it.
for the holidays.
But no, I can't do it. But he just. But it's a again, it's a very
Rough.
there's a rough pain kind of to that scene, and it's never comfortable watching a man shaking a woman. So there are a lot of scenes like that, and of course then there's the existential crisis that George goes through at the end where he attempts suicide. So I mean, and the and again, I'm hopping all over here, but the movie begins and ends with a prayer. The film begins with the kind of heavenly perspective of all these prayers for George Bailey. So the movie sort of begins at that crisis point, and then you get the context and the whole story for Gabriel, the angel who is deployed to help George. And so that's when you get his history, how he grew up, all of that, and then leading all the way up to that point of crisis where he comes to a place where he just feels like he has completely wasted his life. That he's destitute now. He's also in a place where the villain of his life, his enemy, and really the villain of the town, Mr. Potter, is going to drive him out of business, and he'll be financially ruined. So he has spent his whole life giving everything away, living self-sacrificially, and now he's come to a point where it seems like there's no reward whatsoever for any of that behavior. In other words, I gave everything away, and this is where it led me to this house that's decrepit and falling apart. My finances, which are now destroyed, and my enemy who's going to triumph over me, and my whole family, everybody looking at me, everybody depending on me. And he goes and he tries to jump off of a bridge, and then of course there's that amazing creative thought experiment where his guardian angel Gabriel responds to him saying, I wish I'd never been born. Wish I'd never been born. And just says, oh, okay. You were never born. And then George Bailey gets a tour of the world that would have transpired in his absence. And of course, his brother is not alive. because he wasn't able to save his
Mhm.
brother from falling in the ice. And his brother was also a decorated war hero. So all of that is undone. The pharmacist is now an alcoholic and a despondent drunk because he wasn't there to intervene and stop him from making that mistake with the prescriptions. And so, and the whole town has been taken over by Potter. And a fun little side note here, Nathan, which I don't think you'll care about that much or will know, perhaps even know, but the second Back to the Future movie borrowed pretty heavily from this. Some
I
might
did
even
not.
say stole from this. Yeah, where Marty McFly
Oh, yeah, okay.
goes back and the whole town has been taken over by Biff. That's definitely borrowed from It's a Wonderful Life, where George is not. If George has not been born, then Bedford Falls is Pottersville, a kind of modern Vanity Fair. But that's a I think that can count as a synopsis of the film through a series of vignettes on why it's there are heavy doses of reality built in, and it is a sentimental film. But sentimentality is not always a bad thing, by the way. But it's a good film.
Yeah, so what's the staying power there? Because is the audience supposed to then come away with that of recognizing, okay, I'm I I can sympathize and empathize here. I have difficult things in my life, which I think anybody who's
Hmm.
living with any attempt of intentionality or perhaps even not experiences that. There are the ups and downs, there's the brokenness, times in which we are called on to give sacrificially, maybe even beyond what we want to do, and then the continual adding up and addition of the mass of all these little troubles and struggles in life gets us to the point where we at some point look around and say, really, is this what this is all about, and this is what this has gotten me to? Is So I think
Hmm.
it pulls everybody in and puts kind of everybody on that playing field of that sensation. And then I guess the optimistic flip there is to say, yeah, but could you imagine the world if your life hadn't been? Um, and helping people see
Hmm.
the impact that they've actually had in some ways gives a glimmer of hope that there's a fruitfulness to our lives that we can't actually see, but is still meaningful. Is that the
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of different ways of responding to that. I mean, first and foremost, it's a really well made film. And that just has to be stated because time, the harshest of all critics, levels almost everything that's come out, period, at any given time. So, every year, now more so than ever, innumerable movies and books and cultural artifacts are released. And most of them will never be remembered. And that doesn't necessarily
Mhm.
mean they're all bad, but most of them are forgettable. They're here for a time and then they're gone. And that's true of most eras. But those that have staying power, and sometimes a happy accident intervenes. In this case, we had that public domain kind of spectacle that allowed us all to enjoy It's a Wonderful Life. But in the end, quality speaks for itself. So I think first and foremost, this is a great film. Frank Capra made a wonderful movie, and it's well put together. It has all the features of a good film. It's got great pacing. It has fantastic acting and complex and rich characters. That's what saves it from being a merely sentimental Christmas story. And there are some. So I would say that the movie White Christmas with Bing Crosby. So fair, I'll put my cards on the table. I can't stand that movie. So I know it's a lot of people love it as it's a Christmas classic. It's mainly remembered for its soundtrack. Bing Crosby's
okay? Mhm.
crooner voice and all of that. But that is a film that I would say is purely sentimental. And people love it and cherish it mainly because they just there's a nostalgia element to that. I would say that is not the case with It's a Wonderful Life. It has some sentimental elements in it. Most people remember the line from the little girl at the end, every time a bell rings, an angel gets his wings. But it's much more than the sum of its parts. This is a film with, again, very rich characters, and what also gives it staying power, Nathan, is the spiritual vision behind the movie. Now, this isn't in no ways would I wouldn't characterize this as it's not necessarily an orthodox or you know I mean, to call it a Christian movie might be a bit of a stretch. It's a very spiritual film. It does begin and end with prayer. It doesn't give you a conventional picture of God, this sort of flashing, glowing galaxy is God talking, and he has a very grumpy sort of voice.
And its
My
angelology
servant
is a bit
George Bailey,
unique.
he's in despair.
Yeah.
The angelology is a little bit unique. So this is a creative story really about the endurance of the human spirit and very much about relationships. So George Bailey is a rich man, and you see that at the end of this movie, but he's not wealthy. It's not that he's, he's not that prosperous in a material sense. He's wealthy in relationships. He's rich in relationships. And I think if there is a nostalgic element to this film too, but in a more moving sense than with something like, say, White Christmas. In this film, I think for some viewers, there's a longing for a world that no longer exists now.
Hmm.
And Ken Boa points this out, and a lot of critics have pointed this out. I think this is a point that you'll find interesting, Nathan. I think actually you mentioned it when we were talking, because It's a Wonderful Life portrays a world that we don't have anymore, and not just in the sense of the values that are cherished in the movie, but also the kind of community that you have at Bedford Falls, where you have a neighborliness that still exists today, but it's way more difficult to find it. And when you have it, when it's pursued, it takes a whole lot more intentionality these days. People had to depend on one another more intimately in the past because it was more of a necessity. Not the case as much in our DoorDash online world, where many of us are in suburbs where it's entirely possible to live in a huge neighborhood and know almost nobody or maybe two or three people.
Mhm.
But it's also, I mean, all films are time stamped and give you glimpses into bygone eras. I mean, that's one of the values of cinema. You get to look back in time. And It's a Wonderful Life definitely gives you a glimpse back into a world that no longer exists. So I think that gives it a staying power as well. People remember that fondly. They remember an America that isn't here anymore. And also we can complicate that a little bit, Nathan. And so it's not all. So for instance, the Bailey household does have an African American maid. And so there are clearly aspects of this world that we can celebrate as part of the past,
Mhm.
that we're
Mhm.
it doesn't look this way anymore. So in other words, I just want to add that again, films are timestamps. And now when that movie was made, that the decision to feature that in there was probably not a self-conscious one at all. That just merely reflected the social reality of the film as it was made. And it's valuable to see that, and so that we have those historical markers which are there to give us that needed perspective. But it also can help us, it can guard against an unhealthy, there are healthy forms of nostalgia where we can lament, why don't we have that sense of community anymore, those social bonds, those shared values. By shared values, I mean shared values about family, the importance of not just relationships that you choose, but your obligation to your neighbors, and also the sense that those are essential bonds, and that also this wouldn't have even been spelled out, but that there's no controversy on what it means to be a person. That being a human being means you are an essentially spiritual and relational creature with bonds of obligation to all of those around you. All of that is contested these days. In fact, Nathan, I want to throw this out here, and then I want you to run with it for a bit, because I think here's a striking contrast between the world of It's a Wonderful Life and so many of the holiday specials that we see today. So, It's a Wonderful Life gives you a picture of neighborliness, of thick community that was more of a necessity than a luxury. And most of the holiday episodes of TV shows these days or movies, especially the Thanksgiving and the Christmas ones, usually revolve around the fact that the friends in the show didn't choose their families and they have a hard time with their families, but they're so grateful for their friends because these are their chosen family. And so it's the opposite. That's the precise opposite of what's going on in It's a Wonderful Life, where you have a world where, no, you didn't choose these people. And that's part of the basic limitations of
Mhm.
humanity, are that you were born into a certain place and time with these family members, whether you like them or not. And we must learn to pursue those lines of obligation in a holistic way, Whereas now it's no, no, no. You choice needs to be at the forefront of all of your relationships, and that's so. I think that's a really interesting point of contrast. I'd love to get some of your
No,
response to
actually,
that,
I was
Nathan.
I was thinking, not as eloquently put, but I was thinking along those categories earlier when say let's take how many pharmacies were there in Bedford Falls? 1.
Mm,
How many diners? 1. How many,
yep,
there was only one of everything.
yep,
And so you're constrained, like there isn't a choice of which diner do you go to. There isn't a choice of which grocery store do you go to. There isn't a choice of who is your mailman or what. I mean, so there's a sense in which those
right.
constraints of you don't have choices. Like you're not in 1946, Amazon's not going to deliver your Christmas presents. Um, so there was a real limitation on the boundaries of your choices, but that meant that you had to navigate and negotiate the complexities of what you had to deal with. So if you didn't like your neighbor, you're probably going to have to figure out how to work that out because not interacting with him wasn't an option. And so that's one of the
Hmm.
things of the past that I think did build thick community, but let's not act like it was all glorious and wonderful. Um, so that's the complexity
Sure.
that I see there is there's a real, um, but then when you talk about things that bind communities and groups together, part of it is the lack of option that you have for something else. Um, so that's woven in there. I was reading a collection of essays called by the poet Donald Hall, and the collection was called "String
Oh,
Too
I
Short
like
to Be."
him. Yeah.
Do you string too short to be saved? And he has a line in one of those where I can't. The exact quote is "Nostalgia was self hatred," but the preceding line I can't quite recall. It's something like basically when we become dismayed with the anarchy that we experience in the present, we begin to long for the order of the past. And so when you get
Hmm.
really
Hmm.
frustrated with how things are in your life right now, you start looking to the past as a form of escapism from the complexity and the
Yeah.
difficulties of your life that you experience now. So I would separate out the distinction between nostalgia and memory in the sense that if nostalgia is a form of
Mm.
escapism, that's an unhealthy thing to try to retreat to the past and will probably manifest itself in unhealthy ways in our personal lives and in the relationships and the communities that we're
Hmm.
forming now. However, if you can remember good and beautiful and wonderful things of the past or things that you need to learn from the past, I think that also is a wonderful thing and that's a gift. So that's not a form of escapism. It's saying what are the elements and the features here that are part of what a truly wonderful life entails, and then how do I learn from them moving forward? And so fundamentally, it's a looking back in order to find your footing to move forward type of enterprise. And so I think we can do that even with what you were just talking about when it comes to community, is to say, um, hey, there are still really good. You're not going to find a Bedford Falls in America. I mean, it's a different time, but there are still
Right.
really good
Yep.
communities. And Cameron, sometimes you kind of self-deprecatingly refer to kind of suburb life that you live, but in a time of crisis, you still have
Sure.
neighbors who stop by. I think the
Hmm.
difference is that if there are components of something like It's a Wonderful Life that you value, that we all have to recognize that those are all still possible, but they don't come naturally or easily anymore, that you have to cultivate them. And so you won't
You have
accidentally
to
find
pursue them
yourself in
intentionally. Yeah.
yeah, you won't accidentally find yourself in community anymore. So the fact, Cameron, that when
Right.
you have an
Yep.
issue, people reach out, it's because of the work that you and your wife have put in and getting to know the neighbor's kids at the swimming pool and the who's walking their dog at what time. And when somebody goes out to get the mail and Mr. So and so does what and they have a problem and you help them with their car. What I mean, that's how the world works and it's there and it's real, but it does require a renewed sense of effort on our part to make those connections.
Hmm.
And the underlying factor here is the same as the self-sacrificial giving of time and energy and interest in other people's lives. So that component of the if you want to say what's the buy-in in order to form community, it would be that sacrificial giving, um, and reflex to help even if you don't fully know all the details, or if it doesn't make sense at the time. So I'm trying to play here with
Hmm.
what is the same, what is similar, what is necessary, what is possible,
Yes.
what can we
Hmm.
remember and smile about, but not try to hide in. Those are the thoughts dancing around in
Well,
my
the
mind
end
right now.
that's good, and the ending of the film, I think, works along those lines as well. I mean, it bears that out. George and his whole family have poured themselves out for the community. So then in their moment of crisis, everybody comes to their aid. There's nothing unrealistic about that, by the way. I mean, if you're a person who has, or if you've known people who are incredibly giving and who have always, when people who are known for being very giving, who have lived their lives giving to others and self-sacrificially, when such a person finds themselves in a time of profound crisis and they ask for help, they they tend to get it in droves. This is just the
Mhm,
way. I mean, this is a basic reality of human life. We forget this nowadays too, because America sometimes in the background operates with a really vicious sort of social Darwinism. You just got to get ahead. Only the strong survive. Competition is good. Ruthless capitalism, that sort of thing. That's kind of like the dark side of our fierce sense of innovation, right? And our fix it, can do
mhm,
attitude. But the truth is, that's actually false anthropology, which is a mercy. Wonderful news, by the way. Life is actually
mhm.
not fiercely Darwinistic. It's not this massive, horrible struggle. When my father was growing up, his dad bought into this a little bit, and he talked about it in terms of a big wolf and a little wolf, and the big wolves survive and devour everybody else, and the little wolves get killed. But actually, when you find a real crisis happening, people help you. People come to one another's aid. This is true. This is part of the human spirit, I would
Mhm.
call it. And that's not some mystical observation. That's based on the hard evidence of life. I mean, Nathan, you've gone through times of crisis. I've gone through times of crisis. And I mean, also, not by accident, both Nathan and I belong to churches, good churches, just in the sense, good in the sense that the people who love the Lord and love their neighbor. And so, guess what? People have taken care of us. I've been on the receiving end. The ending of It's a Wonderful Life doesn't look unrealistic or like some tacked on happy ending. That looks like life as I recognize it.
Yeah, it's not sentimental to say that we bear one another's burdens. I mean,
No,
it's a biblical reality. I mean, you could see it as a command, but it is also just a description of the way that community supports and takes care of itself. So, yeah, I'm with you on that. I guess here's what's sad to me because George is not a religious person in this film, from my memory. It's not like you would say he has a deep
no,
spiritual life at all.
no. There's a scene where he does pray out of desperation. It's very atheistic kind of prayer.
Okay,
Lord, I'm not a praying man. Yeah.
so here's what I see as the difference, Cameron, because I was actually using these words in my mind of thinking about some of the discipleship, the formation, like what is it that we're trying to train our kids to do? What is it that our parents were training? Like, what were my parents training me to do? And I think there was a sense in like the words that popped into my mind were like to go and to go and to go and to give and to give and to give and to live a life where you're trying to bless, not impress or invest, and then to come to the end of it and lay down to die with a grin. Like I think that's kind of a summary of um a really short meta narrative perhaps of what that life looks like, but the difference is that can you do that with a deep sense of satisfaction all throughout it? So
Mm,
George doesn't have that. But if you look at the teachings of Jesus on the self-sacrificial life of the giving, um, and the caring and the investing and the going and the doing and the what are like prioritizing what's really important in life, then when he says, "My peace I give you, not as the world gives," I think the difference here, or the part that's missing in It's a Wonderful Life, is to see that actually you can live that life and experience the joy of doing it throughout, where it doesn't end in a time on a bridge where you're saying, "Was this all for nothing?"
right.
And
Yeah.
you can also pray, like, "Lord, help me do the right thing, even if I never see the fruit of my effort."
Yeah. Hmm.
Because most of us aren't going to have like there's not going to be an angel that shows up to show us what the world would look like if we never existed.
True.
And
Yep.
I'm not really, I mean, is that a motivation in life to say I'm going to live my life in such a way that if I get to the end of it and look back on if I had never existed, like it seems to me to be unnecessarily complicated and complex and maybe a bit philosophically naive and unproductive. So, is there a better vision that we could have of saying, not because of the goodness of my own heart, but because of what Christ is shaping and forming in me? these are the attributes of a self-sacrificial life that I want to live. But, and this is the key distinction, I can find a deep level of satisfaction and say, this is a wonderful life all the way through it, rather than just at the end in hindsight. And so that would be my hope for me as I live this out, but also as I teach my children what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And I think for anybody listening to this as well, that It's a Wonderful Life as a film pushes on some buttons that we can all recognize, but the gospel offers this good news of great joy to all people. There's another layer to this cake that changes, that adds color to it. Um, Pun slightly intended there. Um,
Mhm.
that I think we don't want to miss out on, and we want to see as part of the beauty of what's happening at this time of year.
Yeah, and I think I want to return real quickly as a parting thought to that observation from Donald Hall. Why would nostalgia be self-hatred? Well, if you dwell on that for a second, I think that there are various aspects to nostalgia, not all of them necessarily bad, but self-hatred would be a kind of nostalgia that keeps you haunting some kind of a past in your mind, or always going back to a past. By the way, usually a sentimentalized version of the past that didn't really exist in the first place. You know, you often hear people. What I mean by that is when people say, "Oh, times were simpler back then." Maybe in some ways, but in other ways, that's not the case. You may have had less responsibilities, or you may not be remembering. Your memory may be a little bit more sanitized. Times The world has fallen, and times are always complex and difficult,
Mhm.
and there are always lots of constraints in any time. But also, why would it be self-hatred? Because if you live in the past in your mind, that's going to cause you to neglect the world you're in now, the present. And if you're not careful, you'll turn your back on the people who need you most now. You won't be present for those who need you now. And so
Mhm.
that's why that's a shrewd observation. And that's why, so we may watch something like It's a Wonderful Life and lament, and there are losses. Yeah, we don't have that kind of thick community, not naturally. It doesn't come as naturally anymore. And that's true. Doesn't mean it isn't possible. Doesn't mean we can't have it. And doesn't mean we shouldn't be about the business of pursuing it.
Yeah, but the flip side of that is, Cameron, is that a modern despair with the way things are in the world, or even in the phrase self-hatred, is in and of itself a focus on self. And so what A Wonderful Life is pointing at, and what we would say, well, we can weigh up that as Christians and say this idea of self-sacrificing and giving and considering the needs of others and bearing one another's burdens and looking for ways in which we can serve and be helpful and support and encourage are all outward facing expressions of the ways in which we want to focus and use our time and our energy in our lives. So I think there's a hope that actually comes from, we all know this, that the happiest people we know are the people who invest the most heavily in other people's lives. And some of the most miserable people we know are those who are
Yeah.
pursuing their own self-interest at all cost. And so joy to the world has some teeth to it here when we start thinking about where is our
Hmm.
appropriate focus on what is real, what is good, and what is my role in it. And so I always um, come back around. One of my favorite lines from him is, "Long lay the world in sin and error pining, till he appeared and the soul felt its worth. The thrill of hope, a weary world rejoices, for yonder breaks a new and glorious morn." And then the fall on your knees is a worshipful response to the beauty of that truth. But ultimately, when our eyes are fixed upward and elsewhere, do we find the proper worship, but then also the proper way in which we live our lives, which then as a byproduct, I think we do find to be quite wondrous and meaningful as we pursue these other goods and glorious things. And so perhaps It's a Wonderful Life will come across your screen at some point in the next few weeks. But if not, or if you've never seen it, A Wonderful Life is something that is offered to you. And we're reminded about part of that great plan as we celebrate Christmas together with our friends and family and fellow brothers and sisters in Christ. You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, the podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, You can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.